All right. We have a lot of questions today. So I know I have tried to put my answers into very succinct points. Hopefully you guys will find these interesting. I know I love the questions that y'all send in. They're they're varied and pretty much on topic. All right. So this first one, this is from Lisa. I prefer beef protein powder. For some reason, any whey product gives me digestive distress. What are your thoughts on beef versus whey? Alan?
Yeah, good question. It's interesting. I think, 10 or 15 years ago, when we talked about different protein supplements, people got really picky and said, oh, you need to have this protein supplement because it's superior to this one and it gives you better protein synthesis and all this kind of stuff. But interestingly, when you listen to those researchers now, 15 years on, they kind of say, well, we could kind of measure that and we could produce some bar graphs that showed that one bar would be taller than the other bar. And there was a statistically significant difference in research and all that kind of stuff. But actually, when you look into the real world, it makes very little difference. And we're now seeing that, a lot of the early research was sort of whey is the best and, animal protein is vastly superior to plant protein because most comparisons were to soy. But now there's been a whole bunch of comparisons to corn protein, potato protein, mycoprotein, which comes from a fungus, um, all sorts of different pea proteins and things like that. And basically, there is very little difference, and to the point where it would probably be indistinguishable for the vast majority of people in the real world. And the reality is that we're not going to get most of our protein from powders. It's going to come from food. And we're not going to sit there going, well, we're going to have this particular food because, we're going to eat milk for dinner instead of having a steak or something like that. So, yeah, I think the differences between the protein powders are much smaller than supplement companies would like you to think. And as I said, even the researchers have sort of really changed their messaging around that over the last 10 or 15 years to come back and say, well, as long as you're getting enough protein, really the type is going to make very little difference. So in that case, I just pick whichever one you prefer in terms of cost, taste, convenience, digestibility, tolerance, all that kind of stuff. If you're concerned about environmental impacts, then that might skew you maybe towards the plant sources as well. But yeah, I don't think it really matters very much, to be honest.
Alan, I think this is a good time too. Are there any specific things you would want to avoid in a protein powder? Or something that would be like red flag, this is, oh, it may be
Mm.
the cheapest on the market, but it might have X, Y, and Z.
Probably the ones that have a million ingredients in them, and the ones where often the ingredients are kind of listed under this proprietary blend, so you can't even really tell what's in them. That's a bit of a red flag, particularly for those who might be subject to drug testing. So more your elite and professional athletes, or even your age groupers that are competing at a high level could be randomly tested at an event, major championship or something as well. So yeah, they're probably the key ones I'd stick away from. And then I guess if you're lactose intolerant or something like that, then like your whey protein concentrates and your milk protein powders and that kind of thing might cause a bit more sort of digestive issues for those sorts of people. But otherwise, no. I mean, generally, I would tend to stick to the products that are just a single ingredient, and then you can plus minus the carbs without having the amount of carbs that you do or don't get dictated in it, or ones that come with creatine or beta alanine, and all of a sudden you're forced to have a certain dose of creatine at a certain time because you need the protein. So I'd much rather separate those into individual products so you can much more personalize what you take, how much you take, and when you take it.
Yes, such an excellent point. That last bit specifically of when they start throwing in other ingredients, it really does limit you, especially because I've seen a lot with creatine now, probably because that's kind of the buzz supplement, is that you're limited. You can only then use that protein once a day, or if they have the 5 grams of creatine in or whatever. So the less ingredients, the better. Staying away from proprietary blends, looking for that NSF or informed sport certification. So, it's been tested. Yeah, I think those are all solid points. So Lisa, you can keep using your beef protein powder if that's what you like. All right, Phil asked, it doesn't matter what type of racing, try running, now gravel, I look bloated. When weighing myself, I have lost weight. It doesn't seem to matter which hydration I'm using, what could be causing this. Phil, I think my first question would be, does this just happen in racing or does this happen in your training as well? Uh, because if so, then I would say, what's the difference between when you're training and when you're racing? And I'm guessing, since he specifically mentioned racing, it doesn't happen in training. Therefore, is it the intensity? Is it the amount of food? Are you trying, or gels or goos, or in this case, hydration that you're mentioning? Are you changing that or trying to increase that on race day? Does that, in combination with the higher intensity, potentially the higher amount of heat, it sounds like the bloating, since you said you've lost weight, isn't like a water retention component. It's probably more of a gas fermentation type of an issue, which then tells me what, I don't know that I'd see that from a hydration product. I would guess it's from the gels, chews, bars, or whatever liquid carbohydrate calorie product you're consuming. So in that say, I would try switching it up. Choose things that either in training that you know don't bother you, practicing what you're going to be doing in racing, practice that in your training. But yeah, I think it's the food sources that you're consuming as opposed to the hydration. Does it sound about good, Alan? Did I forget anything?
No, I think that's about right. Like if you've got abdominal bloating, it's probably because there's gas in there, and that gas usually comes from bacteria munching on stuff in your large intestine, whether that's things like fiber or FODMAPs that will always get there, or whether it's things like your glucoses and your carbohydrates that are meant to be absorbed before they get there that are not being absorbed properly, which is probably a gut training issue.
All right, Phil. So there you go. Take a look at the food you're consuming before and during. All right. Anne Marie asks your thoughts on pine bark benefits. Pycogenol,
Noginol, yeah, yeah,
allegedly to improve sports performance, cholesterol, cardiovascular health. Anne Marie, she always
yes,
comes with these
yeah.
questions.
Yeah, so this particular pine bark extract comes in a bunch of different products under different brand names, but probably in the sports field is most associated with the product called Modex. I'm not sure if that's big in the States, but it's huge over here in terms of marketing. Um, Comes and goes, sort of has its moments, and then it fades away, and then it seems to come back again. Look, it's an interesting one, and I think this is probably a good time to discuss this in the context of supplements more broadly. And this probably comes back to what I was saying before about the protein side of things. But certainly with the pycnogenol, the research is looking, there are different parts of the research for a start. A red flag for me is always this supplement that claims it can improve sports performance and reduce your risk of cancer and lower your cholesterol and stop you having heart attacks and improve your digestion. Like this one supplement that is so amazing that it can do 25 different things. For a start, that's always a big red flag for me in terms of the claims that are made about it. In terms of this one, a lot of the research that has been done is looking specifically around blood flow and improving blood flow. And there does seem to be some evidence that it can improve blood flow. But I guess where I would stick from that point of view is if we're thinking about whether it's sports performance, whether it's cholesterol, blood pressure, heart, other heart disease sort of outcomes, is no one wins an Olympic medal for having the best blood flow. And no one is going to live the longest by having the best blood flow. They're going to live longest by not having heart attacks. That's the outcome that actually matters. And no one's going to win gold medals unless they actually perform better. So with the research into a lot of these supplements, I think the first thing is to look at what are the outcomes that they're actually measuring. And a lot of the claims, if you go to websites of these companies, will talk about, better blood flow or better antioxidant response and those sorts of things. And they're nice, they're interesting, and it might give you reason to sort of look into things a little bit further. But if they're not the actual outcomes that you're trying to get, it's sort of, you have to take a scientific leap of faith from better blood flow to improve sports performance, and what is the evidence that that actually happens. And so that's when things start to fall apart a lot with a lot of these types of supplements. Now, the other thing with this particular supplement is a lot of the studies in here are what they call open label studies. Basically means that the participants knew which supplement they were taking, whether it was a control or the product. So there was no placebo or blinding or anything like that. So the chances of a placebo effect are very high. And not only that, the researchers knew which supplements the people were getting, which introduces a bit of unconscious bias if there's any subjective aspects to the research as well. So that would be, I guess, specific to this product. But I think more broadly in terms of supplements, as I said, don't be sold into the idea of, better blood flow or better antioxidants or, better enzyme activity or whatever it is, because those things aren't actually the outcomes that you want. You need evidence for the actual outcomes, no matter which supplement you're looking at. And I guess the final thing I'd say on this supplement and a lot of the others as well is if they truly did improve sports performance, you can bet your bottom dollar every National Institute of Sport, every Olympic and Paralympic athlete in the world would be using them. There would be dozens and dozens and dozens of studies by those sorts of institutes, just in the way that there has been on creatine and caffeine and things like that. And you don't see that. They just don't exist. So to me, it's either, everyone likes this magic secret that's hiding somewhere that is amazing, but no one's found out about. But trust me, these guys spend their lives trying to win medals. They will look under every single rock for any advantage they can get. And if they thought this was an advantage, they'd all be doing it. And having worked with a lot of them, they're not doing it.
Fabulously, fabulously articulated. I could not agree more. And I think that kind of leads into our next question from Derek. If I could just take that, if it promises to do 7,000 things, if you don't see a lot of elite athletes using it, if it's not being studied by a lot and included in all kinds of products, it potentially doesn't do what they say it's going to do. Now, so Derek asks, do NAD supplements really work for the aging athlete? Are there performance benefits for aging endurance athletes? If yes, what is the best form, how to take, etc.? So right away, I'm going to highlight that, I don't know if it was maybe 4 or 5 years ago, someone came out with a study showing, that like aging, our aging population, there were low levels of different hormones and different things, and saying, oh, as a population, we're not getting these met. Therefore, NAD supplementation is really going to help in terms of improved mitochondrial function and energy and brain benefits and yada, yada, yada. I think it's very hard to separate I think, overall kind of poor daily diet that many, many people are experiencing in their daily lives. And so, yes, if we see, our food, the soil quality is less, so there are lower levels of different vitamins and minerals. And yes, our meat sources and our fish sources might have this, but if you kind of step back from this, like the nitty gritty, it's, are we actually eating a diet that is rich in all of the things that we need? Are we eating it on a consistent basis? Are we getting in the supplements that we need to address any deficiencies from like a blood profile standpoint? The NAD supplement itself, I would say mixed research in the aging population. There have, again, some limited studies have shown that NAD supplementation can help an aging athlete, but here's where the limitations around some of these studies are. They were mostly looking at sedentary populations that came to exercise to do these tests, not necessarily the endurance Ironman athletes that you all are. They were a short amount of time. A lot of them were, how do you feel? And in terms of, are there better options? I would say in terms of performance benefits, that might be something like an acetylcysteine for aging athletes. It could, obviously, creatine, we've talked about that a lot. Proper protein ingestion, proper sleep, daily exercise, all of those kinds of things. So I think that's where I would focus on looking for performance benefits, as opposed to spending money on an additional supplement as an aging athlete. my 2 cents. All right. Joanne asks, just wondering about fueling with MCTs for long distance workouts or Ironman racing. I'm hearing that MCTs can improve energy levels, but haven't seen anything science-based. Thank you. I do appreciate, Joanne, that you asked and specifically mentioned nothing science-based. I would say MCTs for training, no specific benefit. Carbohydrates can improve energy levels. Women might, some of the studies, female athletes responded a little better to MCTs than male athletes. But just because you are experiencing potential benefits from utilizing MCTs, that doesn't mean that doesn't guarantee a performance. So I guess in the studies, it looked at better, I hate using this word, but better fat burning. But as Alan has talked about, I've talked about, fat burning doesn't equal better performance. So I'm just going to clean it off and say, stick to carbohydrates, MCTs. If you like them and have utilized them and they're not giving you an upset stomach, that can be a problem in a lot of athletes. Welcome to keep them in, but in terms of science-based research, let's stick with carbohydrates for performance.
Cool.
Yeah.
So guidance around determining zones to be listed when you're looking at intensity. I love this question because it's something that we see all the time with the Fuelin app and how it integrates with Training Peaks, and then how Fuelin decides how much carbohydrate it suggests that you should have during a particular training session or workout. Because obviously, if you're doing interval sessions, then you might be doing the intervals in zone 4 or 5, but then the recovery is in zone 1. And so how do you kind of work out which zone you should actually allocate within the app? And I'd be interested, Elizabeth, because obviously you've been using Fuelin longer than me, how you tackle this as well. But I guess the way I'd be thinking about it is probably trying to work out what get some idea of what the average would be. So for example, if you're doing a whole bunch of sessions in a whole bunch of intervals in zone 4 or 5, but then obviously your recovery is down in zone 1, I'd be probably listing it as something like zone 3. I think what I would do in this case is I would make it at least zone 3, because that's kind of the move from zone 2 to 3 changes quite a bit in terms of how the Fuelin algorithm then assigns carbohydrate. I don't know if you have any more insights, Elizabeth, having used it a lot more than me.
I think you're spot on. I would almost remind athletes, I have seen a lot of athletes mark things as zone 3, 4, where a very small percentage of that training session is actually zone 3 or 4. And so then we are overcompensating, or the athlete ends up maybe what the coach prescribed versus what the athlete actually does is different also. So I think err on the side of it's probably zone 1, 2. I mean, this is endurance, long distance triathlon. A lot of the sessions are going to be that lower intensity. And like Alan said, if you are doing race pace or higher intensity intervals, and those take up I want to say like 30 to 50% of your actual workout time, that's kind of the factor I look at, then yes, mark it as a zone 3 or above. So if you are, an example would be a track session, a run track session. So let's say the whole session is 60 minutes and you have 6x800s at race pace intensity, and we are, you're going to be coming in and training at a very high intensity, even though there's a 10-minute warm up and maybe a 10-minute cool down. That's a great session to mark as a zone 3 or above.
Yep. Sounds good.
All right. Eric asks, during a 2+ hour workout, I've been taking in 18 grams of protein, Vital Collagen unflavored, mixed with liquid IV. Should I take in more? Say that's probably a highly individualized answer. In for a broad general statement, Eric, I would say no. You're probably about right. I don't know that I love Vital Collagen as your protein source. But I don't know in most sessions that you would need, again, it depends on the session. It depends on how you're fueling the rest of the day. It depends on the intensity of that session if you really needed more than 18 to 20 grams. So I would say if you're feeling good in your training and meeting your overall daily protein requirements, that's probably enough. And then I would ask too, what other sources are you getting it from? Whether that's bars, protein powder mixed in potentially with some liquid, but that's not something I would necessarily recommend. So say focus on your carbohydrates and prioritize your protein before and after your training. Ellen, any thoughts on collagen, proteins, or mixing?
Yeah, I mean, generally, I would tend not to use a lot of protein during training unless there's a very specific reason for it. So, for example, if you're going to eat a meal not long before you train and then you're going to have a source of protein, pretty soon after training, and you've only got, a 3-4 hour session or something like that, I probably wouldn't see the need, as long as you're having, reasonable carbohydrate intake during the session, any need to have protein during it. It does get used sometimes. I know, for example, in the Tour de France, some of the pro teams have been using some protein in the first hour of a stage simply because those guys will have to eat maybe 2 hours before a stage because they've got all the media and sign on and things. And then the stage itself might go for 5 or 6 hours, depending on the day. And then, depending on what they have to do afterwards in terms of media and anti-doping and things, it could be another hour or two until they eat afterwards. So for them, they're going, potentially 8-9 hours without a source of protein. So they see it not as something that's specifically required to fuel the training, but simply to get protein in where there's this big gap that needs to be kind of filled. So they kind of do it that way, and they do it early because obviously when the intensity picks up later on in a stage, then it's going to be much harder to tolerate that. So, look, I think if you're getting adequate carbohydrate, there's probably not a need for massive amounts of protein. And I agree with you, Elizabeth. Collagen I would probably not favor for this purpose. If you are thinking of it in terms of the body using protein as an energy source, I'd be going with a source of protein that has a reasonable supply of branched chain amino acids because they're the ones that generally tend to get used as a fuel source. Now, that's not saying take BCAA supplements at all, but it's simply saying take, maybe more like a whey protein or something that's going to have a reasonable content of BCAAs, but it doesn't have to be a BCAA supplement exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And cool. Then maybe I'm going to guess the same, Eric. I'm wondering about caloric intake during a workout. If I'm burning 2,000 calories during a 2.5-hour bike run, what is a good baseline for intake?
Yeah, I love this question as well because it's a very common one we see. And I think, there's two aspects to this. One is the fact that the Fuelin app itself, when you look at your target calories for the day, it doesn't include the calories that are consumed during the actual training sessions. And so that, I think, for some people, they like that. For some people, it causes a little bit of confusion. So it's just understanding like that's how it works. And I guess the temptation then is to think, okay, well, the app is telling me I should eat this many calories when I'm not training, and then there's this additional part for training. Therefore, I should be consuming, replacing every calorie that I burn in training in the session itself. And that's not the case. So the Fuelin algorithm will actually add calories to the rest of your day for the fact that you're doing bigger training sessions. It's not going to replace every single calorie, but it is going to replace, assign extra calories to the before and after times of your training, and then it will assign obviously some of those calories during the training itself. I would generally never suggest that someone would try and consume 100% of the calories they burn in training during the session itself. It would be almost impossible to do that. You would basically just be constantly eating and drinking. We were talking before about the fact that the amount of grams per hour of carbohydrate that you would use in an Ironman, this was before we started recording, far exceeds what you could physically actually consume, digest, absorb, and tolerate while you're riding or running. And so, adding fat and protein is only going to make that worse. So the point here, I guess, is, the baseline for intake is not about getting a certain amount of calories, or getting 60% of the calories that you burn, or 70%, or anything like that. It's more, I guess, about supplying carbohydrate to keep fueling the exercise, and then using the before and after parts, which is why the traffic light system is there, and will tend to suggest that you consume more leading into those key sessions, and probably a bit more afterwards as well, compared to a day where you're not burning many calories.
Although. All right. Blaine asks, if you are an athlete that has a terrible diet, what extra benefit is there to focus with Fuelin versus focusing on keeping the diet clean? Oh, there's a couple things in here. So, Blaine, I would say, what constitutes a terrible diet? I'm sure that means something different to everybody. And then I would also ask, I dislike the term clean diet, mostly because I don't understand really, like, as if some foods, I assume that you are meaning fruit, veg, protein sources like fish and chicken and eggs. But again, that a clean diet probably means different things to different people. I would say, just in general, the benefit of using Fuelin as an athlete, couple things. One, it takes away all of the guesswork of not what you should be eating specifically, but how much, how often, and at what times. The benefit in terms of, if you are an athlete that has a terrible diet, the accountability that Fuelin provides, I have found, is the most helpful tool for athletes that struggle with consistently fueling themselves with enough and with the right things. Another benefit with the app specifically is that there are recipes in there. And all of these recipes, and again, this is where the clean diet comes in, all of the recipes are foods that we consider part of a healthy, balanced diet. So yes, there are healthy fats in there. There are meats and fish and cheese and milk. And there are plant-based products like tofu, tempeh, legumes, all those kinds of things. So in terms of, if you need accountability, check. If you want help with deciding how much you should be eating, and that's where I think a lot of times that terrible diet comes in, if people aren't fueling themselves properly throughout the day, or if they're making poor choices or not getting enough food, then that's when they reach for less than ideal or less than clean items. They make different food choices when you're starving. Another benefit, again, a list of healthy recipes and foods that that we feel would help you be a healthier, thriving, great athlete. And then it also, with that timing component, allows you to, the decision making is gone. We take care of all that for you. So that would be and tuning into our webinars regularly, you will know that a clean diet really isn't anything specific. I would say a nutrient, a vitamin and mineral rich diet is probably the best way to go. Or a dirty diet. I don't know. I think that's kind of a fun thing to say, but neither here nor there.
I think the thing I'd add to that, Elizabeth, is, and I think it's particularly around that timing and the how much that you just mentioned there. And that's the key thing, is the fact that, you could replace that second part of that sentence, the keeping the diet clean, with any dietary pattern. You could call that Mediterranean diet. You could call that keto diet, carnivore diet, vegan diet, whatever you wanted. It's not I guess any of those dietary patterns kind of tells you a bit about what to eat or what not to eat, or and trying to skew, I guess, your nutrition in a particular way for a particular reason. But what it's not doing is telling you how to adjust that for the ups and downs in your training schedule. And obviously, when you start to do serious training, there are serious peaks and troughs in your training across a week. And that's, I guess, the key thing with Fuelin and the principles of sports nutrition more broadly, is it doesn't matter whether it's clean eating or vegan diet or Mediterranean, like whatever it is, it's the fact that you have to adjust it up and down because your training is going up and down. And so you shouldn't be eating exactly the same every day, when one day you're doing 5 hours of exercise and the next day you're doing half an hour of exercise. And so it's that adjustment for the training, and bringing the data in from training peaks and putting it together with your general nutritional needs to show you how to periodize that, as we would call it. I think that's the key part of it.
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. All right, so Blaine's other question here, saying some simplify the training or racing nutrition strategy to be any fuel works as long as you get in enough calories or carbs per hour. Is there an importance of choosing what source of calories or carbs you utilize, quality and quantity? Another good question, Blaine. I think there's a couple of parts to this. Essentially, if we break it all down, carbohydrate is carbohydrate, and essentially your blood and your muscles don't care whether it comes from rice or bread or Gatorade or gel or which brand of gel or anything like that, because by the time it gets there, those components that make those things different never make it to the blood, or are essentially indistinguishable from a muscle point of view. However, I guess if we think about carbohydrate more broadly, there's a few factors we need to consider here. So the first one is that all carbohydrate we eat, doesn't matter whether it starts out life as a potato or sweet potato, whether it starts out life as oats or rice or bread, so the sort of starchy foods, or it starts out as sugar, your sports electrolyte drinks, your gels, your bars, all those kinds of things. All of it will be digested and broken down into the three basic sugars that all carbohydrates are built off. So glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, we can pretty much discard galactose here because it only really occurs naturally in milk products, and that's not really something that people are consuming during exercise. Well, most people are not consuming anyway. So it's really the glucose and the fructose. Now, glucose and fructose are actually absorbed through two separate pathways in the gut, which actually means that you can get more carbohydrate into the body per hour by having a combination of foods that will digest down into glucose and fructose, which is why most sports nutrition products have a mixture of different carbohydrate types for this reason. Now, this process of different sources of carbohydrate in terms of absorption is only really relevant once you start getting more than about sort of 60 to 70 grams an hour of carbohydrate in, because prior to that, it could be all carbohydrates that break down to glucose, and you've got a capacity to absorb about 60 to maybe 65, 70 grams an hour of pure glucose anyway. So it's only when you start trying to consume more carbohydrate than that you need to start adding in sources of fructose to the mix. Now, most of the sort of starchy foods that we eat, so your bread, rice, potato, all those kind of things I mentioned just before, they will all break down to only glucose. They won't provide any fructose for the body. And so we need to consider that in that context if you're eating real foods, either in training or races. Whereas the fructose is going to come a little bit from fruit if you're eating that, or it's going to come from specifically formulated products. So your gels and your sports drinks and those sorts of things is going to be your main source. So that does sort of differentiate a little bit some of the choices that you might be making based on the sources of carbohydrate that you're getting. There was a lot of talk about 10 or 15 years ago about a specific ratio of glucose and fructose, and that you should have 2 grams of glucose for every gram of fructose. But that was just simply that the studies were designed that way, not because it's better, just because that's how the studies were run. And you go and talk to the people who actually ran those studies, and even they say there is no magic ratio. That's just what we chose for those studies. So yeah, as long as you're getting sort of up to 60 to 70 grams an hour from sources of glucose, and then any additional carbohydrate needs to come from sources of fructose, or you're more likely to get gut issues. And I guess that comes to the other point around the source of carbohydrate. One of them is going to be around the gut issue side of things, and that can be very different for for different people, as we've talked about in previous Q&As. For some people, solid foods are much more difficult to tolerate. That can be improved with gut training, which we've talked about. Also, depending on how hot it is or isn't, how much fluid you're going to be consuming per hour based on your sweat rate, that might dictate a little bit, how much of your carbohydrate comes from liquid sources versus solid sources as well. So that will also be something that you need to take into account. Some of it can be practical things, things that you like the taste of that you're more likely to want to consume more of, or things, even the brands of gels. Some people just find certain gels they just find really easy to tear open, and other ones they really struggle with. And it is so different from one person to the next. It's really personal preference for that kind of thing. So yeah, I think the importance of choosing things here is not necessarily some of it is sort of scientific and theoretical, but a lot of it is also practical and logistical as well in terms of what you can carry, what you like, what you tolerate, what you can afford. Sometimes some of this stuff's frightfully expensive if you're going to consume a lot of it as well. So a lot of different factors there, but sometimes I think we can over science it a little bit.
All right, so
All
this
right.
is Paul's question. What is your view on fresh sourdough bread? I love it. There are lots of lunch options that are detailed in Fuelin, but few contain sourdough. Oh, what a travesty. Would sourdough be the best option for normal meals instead of specific fueling for a session where white toast would be the better option? Take it.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess sourdough here, I think people have different preconceived ideas of what sourdough actually means. So technically, sourdough would be bread made from a very specific type of yeast. And so that will produce slightly different sort of carbohydrates within the bread. And sourdough, genuine sourdough bread made with genuine sourdough yeast will produce a bread that is lower in FODMAP, like a wheat bread that is lower in FODMAP. And so that can be really helpful for some people that need to kind of lower FODMAPs to avoid kind of GI issues. And particularly when you're sort of carbohydrate loading, where the amount of carbohydrate you consume is a lot more for most people than they would eat on a day-to-day basis, that can be quite important as well. So that would be maybe a reason that you would choose to go with sourdough bread. But other than that, you know, the fiber content isn't dictated by the fact that it's sourdough. The whole grain content isn't dictated by the fact that it's sourdough. It's just the type of yeast that's used. So whether it uses wholemeal flour or grain flour or has seeds and things in it, like that doesn't matter which sort of bread it is. And so those choices are based on how much fiber you want at any given time. If you want more fiber from just a general day-to-day health point of view, or you're specifically going low fiber because you're leading into a training session where you don't want that fiber, or because you're trying to eat a lot more than you normally would, then you may have to lower the fiber content. In that case, it doesn't matter whether it's sourdough or not. But I guess coming back to the question there, and having a lot of the options in Fuelin don't include sourdough bread, well, you could just substitute it. There's no issue with there. Absolutely, you're going to get the same amount of carbohydrate. If it's white sourdough bread, it's going to have the same amount of fiber or lack of as normal white bread as well. So there's no magic or secret there. You can just swap them out.
And Alan, would you say the same for like a rye bread or a pumpernickel or something? Like when we give bread examples, other than maybe the white bread, say before a training session or something, are the breads interchangeable?
Yeah, usually. Unless there's a very specific issue, like you need a gluten-free diet, so you have gluten-free bread. But other than that, no. It's sometimes it's more just about taste preference and things like that. And certain breads might taste better or have certain characteristics in terms of texture or something that make them maybe more suitable to certain recipes and things like that. But that's probably about it.
Yep, I agree. And I say switch up your bread options as often as
Mm.
possible and get them from a bakery when you can. All right. Michael asks, my question relates to Training Peaks plan adjustments and synchronization with the Fuelin app. For example, I couldn't run and wanted to log my reason and set Training Peaks training time to 0. Does my fuel intake adjust accordingly to reflect time change? Do I have to reset my Fuelin plan to show 0 time? I'll sum it up with saying, yes, if you do not do a session, it's best to mark that training session, either remove and rerun your plan. It's if you know ahead of time that you're not going to do a training session, then either move that training session to a different day, set the time to 0, and rerun your plan. And yes, then the app does adjust accordingly based on your activity, and therefore base your total caloric intake over the day and over the week to reflect the change.
But the key there is to rerun the plan. Otherwise, Fuelin won't know that you've changed things.
Thank you. Yes. Rerun the plan. All right. Ben says, I know you need all 3 macronutrients. However, if I'm trying to become, a fat oxidation machine, what breakdown should I have? I'm aware cutting carbs altogether is not the way. Please help provide some guidance.
All right. Good question, Ben. There's a few different angles you can kind of take this from. I guess the first one is, do you need to be a fat oxidation machine in the first place? Or will just a normal level of fat oxidation be okay? Certainly, you're right. If you take that to extremes in terms of low carb diets, you'll probably get a bigger response in terms of fat oxidation, or you might force that response more quickly. I guess if we think about what increasing fat oxidation means, so the ability to use fat as a fuel during exercise or even outside of exercise, it's the body's adaptation to its environment essentially. So the reason that a low carb diet will do this is because you basically not provided carbohydrates. So the body says, well, I can't produce energy from a fuel source that's not available. So I'm forced to improve my ability to use it from other sources. Now, particularly if you're doing a lot of long training sessions, you can get these adaptations while eating a fairly normal carbohydrate diet. And there is a bit of research to show this now. We see this in ultra runners, for example, who go out and do lots of multiple hour training sessions. And the theory around this is what's called the glycogen threshold hypothesis. Basically says that it's where you finish exercise, not where you start, that determines how the body is going to adapt for the future. So if you finish a lot of training sessions with not much carbohydrate left in the tank, so low muscle glycogen, then your body is going to adapt and get better at using fat, regardless of how full that tank was when you started. And this is where that periodized approach and using the red, yellow, green system is helpful, because it ensures that don't go out and do these sort of shorter training sessions with massively full tanks of carbohydrates. So you finish the session and you're still half or three quarters full, if you like, because then you're not going to get those kind of adaptations. Whereas if you're doing lots of long training sessions, even if you start with a full tank, it's probably going to be pretty empty by the end. And so you'll still get that kind of adaptation. But I think one of the key things I would say here is it's not just about the amount of carbohydrate or fat that you do or don't have in your diet. It's also about the type of training that you do. Because if you are doing a lot of high intensity interval type training, you are demanding a massive or very rapid use of fuel in the body. And that's very much going to favor carbohydrate. So one of the other things around trying to improve fat oxidation is doing a lot of sort of lower intensity, longer duration training sessions. And that's fine if you have the time to do that. But for some time crunch people, that's not really that easy or practical for them. And so that does become a bit more of a challenge. And in that case, maybe you do have to lower the carbohydrate a little bit, increase the fat as well, because it's not about lowering your overall calories. It's about keeping the same calories and just changing the fuel mix there. But probably the most effective way is to do more sort of lower zone, longer training sessions, as much as it is the nutrition side of things.
Great. Justin, oh, I love this question. I love it so much. Am I using too much protein powder if I'm fortifying a breakfast, drinking a shake, and sometimes adding protein at night to meet my target? Can you suggest alternatives to hit the targets you have set for me? So I like to keep probably 2-ish servings of protein powder a day, not because 3 would be toxic or too many, mostly because the cost goes up when you're consuming a lot of protein powder. But also, I wonder then, are you relying too much on a powder and not focusing enough on real food sources of protein, and therefore missing out on different vitamins and minerals and all the other things all the benefits you get with eating real food? So if you do need multiple protein powder sources during the day, I realize some of our athletes, that are getting in 200 plus grams of protein a day, there's probably no way you're going to get around it without one and probably 2 servings of protein powder a day. Especially if you have double training sessions and, you don't have access to a kitchen all day long if you're at work or something like that. So suggestions for alternatives. I have a ton. For breakfast, I would say doing the yogurt breakfast is an excellent, because people always say, oh, if I do a smoothie, then I've got protein powder. If I do, oatmeal or whatever, adding yogurt, whether you mix that in with an oatmeal, whether you have it on the side, whether you mix it into, and you can use yogurt or cottage cheese in this case, mix it into overnight oats. Cottage cheese with overnight oats, if you haven't tried it, definitely adds a different taste, but in a good way. And there you've got that source of protein. Obviously, doing some kind of eggs or adding liquid egg whites. Make your own homemade waffles or homemade pancakes and using those additional liquid egg whites to boost that protein content up. Plant-based athletes, that could be adding some tofu, blending that into a smoothie. Really no taste there. Using the tofu, scrambling it up as if it was an egg and adding some veggies and whatnot to that. It could also be adding chia seeds or hemp seeds, and be careful because that does increase your fat intake for the day. It could be utilizing different milk sources, so either regular cow's milk or something like a soy milk that's a little bit higher in protein, or any of the fortified nut milks. And then looking at adding different protein sources throughout your day in order to meet protein requirements without having to rely on a shake. So that would potentially be hard-boiled eggs, edamame, any kind of jerky. You can use deli meat, like sliced deli meat, and snack on that, make lettuce wraps. You can, again, using a yogurt somewhere throughout the day. And I also suggest, if you do have higher protein requirements, adding a little more to each meal. So maybe if you were only getting 30 grams at your meal before, maybe shoot for 35, 38 grams over those 3 meals. And then you've got in at least an additional 20 to 30 grams by just adding a little more at each of your main meals. All right, I hope that helps. Okay. I think we are good. So I will open it up to anyone on the call. If you guys have, we have 3 minutes. Perfect timing. Alan, we got through all these. I'm so stoked. We did it. These were a lot of questions today.
Mm.
So on the call, folks, in our 3 minutes. Manny, yes, you have one.
So over the weekend, I did one of the experiments where I did 2 scoops of super fuel per hour, and it tasted like just drinking water. That works out, if I did my math correctly, to about 29 grams of carbs per hour. So on the next go around of that exercise, should I up it to 4 scoops?
So
Yeah.
is the aim here around sort of gut training, Manny?
Yes. Manny and I are working on increasing carbohydrate consumption, gut training. And so he had 2 bike sessions this past weekend. So one of them we did with gels and chews, and one we did with the liquid. We're trying to figure out how they worked, what he liked and didn't. So that's the background.
Yeah.
What do you think, Alan? Yeah, doubling.
Yeah, I think so. Like, I think doubling from that level. I mean, if you're going from like 50 to 100, that's a big jump. But 20 to 40, it's probably fine. Yeah, I think jumps of 20 grams an hour are perfectly fine. And you may get a little bit of discomfort on the first go, but after the second, third, fourth one, you probably won't, and then you can go further if that's the goal.
Cool.
I really like working with Manny. He's like, if I say this is what we want to try, he tries it, he does it, even if he doesn't particularly like it. He's like, okay, I'll stick with it.
Like that gel.
Like that, I know. The first person that's ever said you didn't like the precision gels. I'm surprised.
Maybe it's because it was the shock. I've never done it before. And my first reaction was, where can I barf this? But I overcame.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. You stuck with the plan despite not liking it. Thank you very much.
And my new supply came in today, so I'm set for the weekend.
There you go. Good. Great.
I have a question if we got a minute
Yeah.
before you go. On my app, right now I'm obviously doing the full training, full Ironman. My daily is 450 grams of carbs. I can't hit that. That's too much. I'm curious. Obviously, I don't know the programming behind it, but it's high. I can't even get close to that. So don't know. I mean, my settings, nothing's changed, but it's really bumped up. I got 190 on the protein, 105 on the fat, and then 450. I can't even.
Yeah, that's a lot. Are you racing in the next week? Did your training change dramatically?
No, I'm 6 weeks out
What
from
what was it?
California.
What was it sitting at before? I can go back and look.
I was around 300,
Yeah, that's
350,
kind of
which
what.
seems I can do 300.
Yeah.
That's doable, but I can't do
So just
450.
just looking in the app at the moment, so that's for you, obviously, because it'll vary depending on body weight as well. So, the
Yeah.
carbohydrate recommendations are based on grams of carbs per kilo of body weight, and then obviously based on the training load as well. So for you, that's it's averaging about 5 grams per kilo per day. And you're training, what, about 18 hours this week. So I wouldn't have thought that was an unreasonable amount. What I'd probably do in that case, if you're struggling to get enough food in, is you could possibly back off the protein a little bit and maybe the fat a little bit, because protein, you're up at 2.2 grams per kilo. That could probably dip a little bit under 2 and still be okay. And fat wise, you could probably, you're sitting at what, about 105. That could probably drop to, 85, 90, something like that. And that would maybe free you up a bit of room to fit that food in. The other thing I would say there is, often people with big training volumes do struggle to get in enough fuel in general, whether it's calories more broadly or carbohydrates specifically. And sometimes then that's when people have to go to those more kind of refined, tightly packaged sources of carbohydrate. And that's something that I think some people struggle to get their head around initially, because they sort of say, oh, you're telling me to eat quote unquote unhealthy, or that the dirty, as Elizabeth was talking about before, in terms of, oh, you're telling me to eat, white rice or white bread instead of brown rice and that sort of thing. But sometimes it is that, because if you are consuming 450 grams of carbs a day, you're going to get some fiber coming along with that. And, once the carbohydrate goes up higher and higher, the fiber intake is going to build as well until it becomes a barrier to getting food in. And so what you tend to find is the athletes with the highest training loads have to have the quote unquote lowest fiber or more refined foods. They actually end up getting the same amount of fiber. It's just spread across more food. So I'm not sure if that's helpful for you, but it might be about some of the food choices.
I'll try that. Yeah. I'll try to back off protein a little bit. The problem is, I also have, one of the earlier questions was with that bloating. I do suffer. I got to figure out, I have some GI issues. I don't know what it is, but I noticed when I increase my carbs, I end up with bloating, whether it's during training, but definitely during racing, because obviously the carb intake goes up during the races when it's high intensity, and I do end up with just feeling like there's a pump inside my stomach by the time I finish the race. So it's this balance of not too many carbs because I have GI issues, but also I need the energy source to get the training in.
Yeah.
And I think don't be afraid to shy away from, like Alan said, the less desirable. So, a glass of tart cherry juice, or orange juice, potentially some of those, like a granola, like added granola. It's like we did in our carb loading session, adding little bits here and there. It's not just that bagels, pasta, rice component. It's, cereal, it's juice, it's very like what did Scott say, like a child's diet some of the time, and finding, because there's vitamin C in orange juice, and tart cherry juice has been shown to help with sleep and those kinds of things. So it's not like we're just saying like spoon the sugar into your mouth. We're still saying choose foods that could potentially help fill, but also meet those daily requirements as well.
Yeah. Okay.
When you say reset the plan, what does that mean?
As in rerun?
Well, okay. When you were talking about the training peaks adjustment, and then what does that mean? Reset or rerun the plan?
Yep. Do you want to explain, Elizabeth?
So
I'll just-
when you make changes, there's a button in your plan, Manny, that says rerun my plan. And that just means that changes have been made that will affect your caloric needs for the week. So you just hit that. Oh, see, there it is. Thank you very much.
Update my plan. That's the one.
Update my plan.
It
Sorry.
says rerun for us, but update for clients. Yeah.
Update my
Yeah.
plan.
So that will then go back to Training Peaks, pull that information again, and then redesign the plan if anything has changed in Training Peaks.
Great question, because I think it's so routine for me that I forget that it's not necessarily for everyone. So thank you for asking. Thank you for the visual. A visual helps. All right. Well, I'm gonna stop recording.